Take a look at these two video clips. Which one do you prefer? I will give you a couple of seconds to watch and decide. Okay, if you chose this one, well done, because it displays smoother frame rates brought about by a better firmware on the Philips OLED+935. Let me explain. Hello everyone, Vincent Teo from HDTV Test here. When I reviewed the Philips OLED+935 last year, I found that although the TV could accept and display 120 frames per second signal at 1080p resolution, half the frames would be discarded, so there's actually no improvement in motion clarity and smoothness compared to a 60 frames per second video signal. All credit to Philips. They listened to my feedback and recently sent across a beta firmware which fixed the issue. This is the same footage you saw in the intro. It's basically a 120p video clip from the excellent Meridio 7G signal generator, displayed on the Philips 935, which is of course 120Hz, like all OLED TVs are. I then filmed the results in 120 frames per second using a Sony a7S III camera, but because YouTube doesn't support 120 FPS or high frame rate output, I had to slow the footage down to 60 FPS. As you can see from this side-by-side comparison, the TV is no longer skipping frames with the beta firmware loaded, confirming that it is correctly displaying 120 frames per second without frame drops. Also, if you look at the input lag measurements, before the firmware, the input lag at 120 frames per second was fluctuating between 7 and 22 milliseconds, because the television was dropping frames. But after the beta firmware was installed, the input lag figure held steady at 22 milliseconds, which, while not as crazy fast as LG OLEDs, was still an improvement upon the 36 milliseconds at 60 frames per second. Of course, the Philips OLED+935 doesn't have HDMI 2.1 ports, so if you select 120Hz on the Xbox Series X, the resolution will drop to 1080p. Still, some of you may be willing to take the slight hit in resolution in exchange for lower input lag and faster gaming responsiveness, so at least you will be getting higher motion clarity too with the new beta firmware, which displays 120 FPS without frame drops. Unlike the Xbox Series X, the Sony PS5 doesn't allow you to force 120 frames per second on a console level, but you can enable it on a game-by-game basis if the game supports it, of course, though usually with a noticeable decrease in texture and detail, or fast and fugly as I like to call it. LG OLEDs with 4 HDMI 2.1 ports and VRR support are still the best gaming TVs, especially for pairing up with next-gen consoles, such as the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. But the unique selling proposition of Philips TVs is Ambilight, which is the company's integrated bias lighting technology. Specifically for playing games, you can set Ambilight on the OLED+935 to output a gentle, static D65 bias lighting which can reduce eye fatigue, especially when playing in a dark room, or to synchronize with the content on screen to give you more immersion by expanding the surrounding glow. In either case, we have measured no increase in input lag with Ambilight engaged. And thanks to the company's firmware fix in response to our feedback, 120 FPS gameplay will look clearer and smoother going forward. According to Philips, the new firmware will be available from next week for owners to download, and OTA rollout will begin from the 3rd week of March. If you would like to watch our OLED TV reviews, I've created a playlist here if you would like to click on it, and I will see you in the next video.